Sounds good, and I can see Laura's hit the record button for those that aren't able to make it today. And Toby, seeing as you've got the slides up, do you just want to drive the pack all the way through?
Very happy to do so.
Cool, thanks.
All right, we seem to be leveling out on participants. I think we might kick off. Welcome all. My name is Toby Price. I look after the Future System Design team at ESOO WA, and it's my great pleasure to chair this session on the 2024 Wholesale Electricity Market Electricity Statement of Opportunities, the WEM ESOO. And this is one of a number of stakeholder sessions that we've held during the preparation of this report. And we're really excited to share some of the key findings from that report and solicit your feedback and insights and discussion. So I'm going to run through a few introductory slides. First of all, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. For me, that's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay respects to their elders past and present. The next slide, I'm not going to go through in detail, but we're really calling out our commitment to complying with applicable laws, and in this case, the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010. And the slide really outlines the participation requirements for ESOO forums, particularly with reference to the sharing of competitively sensitive information. So if you've not appraised yourself of this slide from previous sessions, please take the time to review. The next slide is just a bit of online housekeeping. During the presentation, if you could please mute your microphones, and similarly, if you could leave your camera off, but we'd be delighted to see you through the Q&A. And we expect to have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. You're very welcome to comment in the chat at any time through the presentation. We'll take those questions as read, and unless we need any further clarity, we might ask you to kindly come off mute and expand. Otherwise, please raise your hand and we'll call on you at the end. If we could request you to state your name and organisation before you ask your question, that would be greatly appreciated. And finally, there's a recording of this forum that's already started, and the presentation will be published on our webpage. And as with all of our stakeholder forums, we'd really appreciate any feedback to the forum format and content to the WA Electricity Forum at amo.com.au email address. And that's it from me. I have the great pleasure of handing over to Kate Ryan, our Executive General Manager for WA and Strategy, who will take us through the key insights from the ESOO. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Toby, and thanks everyone for joining as we give you a quick run through of the key findings from our 2024 Wholesale Electricity Market Electricity Statement of Opportunities, that mouthful which we will call the ESOO from here on. So we publish this annually. It provides a 10-year forecast of where demand is heading in the Southwest Interconnected System, where supply is sitting based on current committed and retirement dates, and really the purpose is to identify opportunities for investment to help close any gaps that might be shown. Particularly for the WEM ESOO, this also plays a key role in our reserve capacity mechanism. So as part of that mechanism, we set about 2 years ahead of time the requirement that we then procure for through our capacity mechanism. So at the moment, we're in the 2024 capacity cycle, which is all about procuring capacity for the 26-27 capacity year. So we focus a little bit on 26-27 for that reason. We just go through the key findings. For those that read these reports annually, Not a huge difference between this ESOO and last year's ESOO. On the consumption side, and we'll touch on all of these in a little bit more detail, we are seeing strong growth in consumption and in demand over the forecast. So consumption being the total amount of electricity consumed annually, demand being the maximum at a point in time. So they're the difference there, both growing. However, slightly more moderate growth compared to last year, reflecting a bit of a moderation of our economic circumstances and some large loads drifting, if you like, a little later in the piece. We're also seeing probably stronger than previously forecast uptake in small-scale solar rooftop PV. And I've got a slide on that a little bit later as well, but that's an important component. In terms of the key findings, though, the supply-demand situation has improved, particularly the near-term supply-demand balance since the last ESOO, and that's because we've got about almost 1,500 megawatts of new capacity under construction at the moment, about 600 megawatts of which should be online in time for this summer, and the remainder by next summer, give or take. So someone found themselves in the wrong forum, did they? Not that bad. So yeah, a significant improvement to the near-term outlook, but quite importantly, as we go beyond 2027 onwards, really there is a significant need for kind of sustained investment of quite a significant scale in our system to enable the energy transition. So I'll touch on all of those in just a little bit more detail in the next slides. So let's move over to consumption. And this shows a bit of a stacked chart of the key areas of consumption. So again, this is annual consumption over the course of the year. And probably the most noteworthy trends in this slide, you can see the very light purple kind of wedge at the bottom there is residential consumption. And as you can see, that's declining significantly over the period. And that's really the impact of rooftop PV continuing to provide more and more of residential demand, meeting demand over the course of the year. The growth is really coming through the business consumption, which includes electrification by businesses as part of their decarbonisation and other plans. And that's where we're really seeing significant growth over the period, particularly as you can see from about 28, 29 onwards, where we do see a notable uptick. Electric vehicles, of course, will play a role, again, accelerating really from about the end of this decade onwards. And as you can see at the top there, how much of demand is increasingly being serviced by behind the meter rooftop PV or distributed PV, as we've called it on this slide. We do expect energy efficiency to displace some consumption at an increasing rate over the period, which is that sort of dashed light purple at the top there. And of course, there are losses on the system, which is what's reflected in that red chunk. So what you can see with that dashed black line, that's essentially the consumption to be serviced from the grid. And the top, of course, underlying consumption once we put back in that consumption that's met behind the meter or in the distribution network by rooftop PV predominantly. And I think I've probably touched on this, but just the left-hand column, you can see with some of the key drivers of the growth. We are seeing economic growth, population growth over the entire period, so that is driving underlying growth in demand. And electrification is another key driver. Electrification of transport, which is called out specifically with EVs, but also electrification of households and businesses in terms of their energy use are definitely key parts. The main uptick in consumption, which you'll see reflected in the demand forecast on the next slide, in that business consumption is really at the back end of this decade when we expect to see some of the hydrogen loads start to enter the system. So this is demand for electricity to create hydrogen, which is why it's showing up on the consumption side. And we do expect some relatively small projects in the terms of the hydrogen sector, but big in terms of consumption on the Swiss, starting to emerge at the back end of this decade. Let's have a look at demand now, which shows a similar pattern. And this has the main chart here has our summer peak demand. And so since about 1990, summer peaks in the Swiss have been higher than winter peaks. So we've been a summer peaking system. Which is why we focused on summer peak demand, and that remains the case for the majority of this outlook period. What's really interesting before I jump onto the summer peak demands specifically is we're seeing peak demand in winter and summer converge over time, and that's really a reflection on the electrification of homes and businesses for heating, among other things. We've obviously been electrifying for cooling for many, many years. It was the air conditioning boom of the sort of 1990s and 2000s, which pushed us to being that summer peaking system. Now we're increasingly seeing electrification of heating loads, which is leading to a bit of that convergence, as well as the underlying economic growth and other things over the course of the next decade. So at the back end of the decade, back end of the 10-year outlook period, we actually see winter demand potentially being higher than summer peak demand. Obviously, there's a forecast. We'll see how they transpire, but nonetheless, it's very clear that summer and winter peaks are converging over this next decade, which is quite interesting. And as you can see from particularly the summer peak demand forecast, although the winter show a similar pattern, our expected case is the one in the middle there, the purple line. The bold lines are this year, the dashed lines are last year, just to orient you on this chart. We are seeing growth throughout the 10-year outlook period in peak demand, and I'm focused on the kind of the purple expected line in the middle there. And then from about the back end of the decade, 28, 29 onwards, a slightly more accelerated growth rate, linking to that uptick in large industrial use, particularly hydrogen, as we head into the 2030s. The high case has more positive, I guess, economic assumptions and more load coming on a bit earlier, and the low case more subdued, I guess, economic conditions and population conditions. But in all cases, we are expecting obviously growth over the period. Worth reflecting that we, as we do every year, we take on board the most recent weather and demand information that we have. I'm sure you'll all recall, particularly if you're in the Perth area, or anywhere in WA actually, we had our second hottest summer on record. The summer just passed in WA and set some peak demand records on our system, quite significantly higher peaks than we had seen historically. So we have adjusted, I guess, our starting point of these forecasts to take into account that most recent weather information, as well as, of course, historical weather and trends that we're seeing there. These are the main things I wanted to call out on this one. Let's move on to some of the underlying, I was going to say demand forecasts, but some of these are demand and some of these help meet demand. But what's happening at the distributed energy resources part of the mix, because this is always quite interesting and is an area of quite significant change at the moment. So the top chart there, you can see we are expecting continued uptake in DPV, or distributed rooftop solar. We've got give or take 3 gigawatts on the system currently, and we're expecting that to more than double by the end of the 10-year period. You can see in the chart at the top, the purple line being the expected case, the high, the sort of tealish being the high. Should follow a very similar pattern over the period. There are very different sort of underlying assumptions going into those, but what they end up driving actually is quite a similar trajectory for DPV installations. Down the bottom, I guess the newer kids on the block from a DER perspective, DES, or distributed electric, what do we call them? Energy storage systems, distributed batteries, essentially, bottom left there. We are seeing potentially quite significant uptake off a low base, particularly in the more expected and high economic scenarios there, and a more subdued uptake in a low economic environment. So we could see potentially distributed storage starting to play a really significant role, particularly again from about sort of 28, 29 onwards, helping soak up that glorious solar that our rooftop PV systems are generating and transfer that to be used later in the day. And then electric vehicles, again, coming off a low base, but they are becoming ubiquitous on the roads, and we do expect that to continue. As you can see, in both the expected and the high cases, we would expect more than 500,000 electric vehicles on the roads in the Swiss by the end of the period. So that's quite a significant increase in electric vehicles. And in all cases, we see electric vehicle uptake growing fairly significantly over the period. So we will see more and more of those distributed energy resources on our system, contributing in some cases to demand, but also obviously providing a supply side impact as well. Probably the other noteworthy thing on DER is on the the solar systems, the DPV capacity, which is a continuation of the trend that we've been seeing for quite some time now, which is customers installing larger and larger systems. So while the number of systems being installed annually is declining slightly over time, the size of those systems continues to increase, and that's really what's driving that strong growth over the period, and driven by, as the notes say, their relatively good pricing and short payback periods. So quite an attractive proposition for customers still. So that's, I guess, the demand side, the consumption and the peak demand side. Now, if we put that together for what is probably the most important overall picture in the ESOO, which is what does our supply-demand balance look like? The purple line at the top there being demand, our 10% probability of exceedance expected scenario, and plus our reserve margin. So I'm going to come to how we set the reserve capacity target in a sec. And then the teal line being the supply, both committed, current and committed supply, and the dashed lines are last year's equivalent forecasts. So if I can just pause for a moment, and I am going to come back to how we set the reserve capacity target, but that purple line, while it follows the pattern of the peak demand forecast, it does include the margins that we have to cover over in terms of planning margins. So we cover both the risk of contingency events, things like unplanned generator outages, higher than expected demand, things that could go wrong, I guess, between now and the time we're forecasting for, as well as the reserves that we need to hold for frequency keeping, or FCAS on our system, frequency control and essential system services. They're built into that purple line to work out actually the reserve capacity target, which is the amount we need to procure through the reserve capacity mechanism. And as I said at the start, 2026-27 is the particular number that we're setting with this ESOO. The reason why that teal line has come up significantly from last year was what I was mentioning at the outset. We have seen commitment to significant investment in our system, and that's really now resulting in a much improved supply-demand outlook through now until about 2026-27. But then, as you can see, with demand continuing to grow and those step-down retirements in our coal-fired power stations, we do see the gap opening up from 2027, and really that's to message or to signal that there is a need for continued investment in our system. And that, I think, starts off, I think the numbers are later in the slide pack, about 390 odd megawatts by 27-28, growing to almost 3 gigawatts by the end of the period. The next slides, I think, just touch a little bit more on the investment required and really just to focus in on the next 5 years, 26-27 being the one we're setting the target for. And that year, based on current commitments, is looking fairly healthy. So provided that pipeline of investment comes on in the sort of timeframes that are indicated, we look like we are currently in balance for that year. We are in a bit of a deficit still for this coming summer, 24-25. The situation has improved significantly since we did these forecasts last year because of the commitments to new investments. However, we do find ourselves with the residual shortfall based on these numbers in the order of 124 megawatts. So we do expect to trigger the supplementary reserve capacity mechanism for this summer. We are just finalising the specific number that we will seek because in addition to this analysis, we also have a look at what's in what outages are expected to continue on through the summer period, and whether there's any other factors we need to take into account, any delays with facilities or those kind of things. So we're just assessing all of that information to work out what the right level of reserve that we need for this summer will be. So keep your eyes posted for some further information on supplementary capacity over the next few weeks. Next summer, 25-26, either one probably works, looking fairly healthy. In our forecast, in that teal line we had on the previous slide, we had included about the 1,000 megawatts of capacity that AEMO has procured through two non-co-optimised essential system service procurements. What we don't have in those is Synergy's commitment to building a large battery in Collie. That's that plus 500 megawatts you can see on there. We factor that in from 26-27, but it's possible it will be online during 25-26. So if it comes online in 25-26, that outlook is pretty healthy at this point as well. And then, as I said, 27-28 onwards, we do need some further investment to meet the growing demand and to replace the coal effectively as it's retiring. And the final one just gives you a sense of what we can currently see in the pipeline. And so we've got obviously existing capacity at 1462, or as I said, almost 1,500 megawatts of committed capacity currently under construction to come online in the next couple of years. We are also aware of, through things like our expression of interest process and other things and the information requests we do for the ESOO, there's at least another 500 odd megawatts of quite probable capacity that could be developed in the timelines for 26-27. And so there is a healthy pipeline there to meet, I guess, the near-term outlook. However, as you can see, growing to 3 gigawatts or 2,880 megawatts by the end of the period, we are going to need further investment beyond what's currently in the pipeline and being tracked. And I'm aware there is obviously a lot of projects that are being progressed at various stages of development. So I think the encouragement from AEMO would be to keep developing those projects. We think they've got a place. So that's, I guess, the headline results from this year's ESOO. I'm just going to touch on a few elements of our reliability assessment for a couple of reasons. Well, one, because we think it's really interesting, but also because there were a number of changes made to the WEM rules ahead of this ESOO, which we're assessing now for the first time. And these changes at their heart are about really making sure that our assessment, our reliability assessment for the ESOO, is keeping pace with the energy transition. So we know as we transition from a predominantly thermal generation fleet to one that's more reliant on weather-dependent renewables, we know that changes the nature of the reliability assessments we need to do. We now operate on a constrained grid and have better information about how we factor in network constraints and the impacts in regions of the grid. So there's an element there. So really a number of changes all about signalling over time more precisely the nature of the capacity that we need on the system, where it is, what its characteristics are. So in many cases, this is the first year we've done it. And while the results don't change the outlook kind of immediately, they are things that we will be continuing to assess and I think improve our assessment of. And we expect to provide further information in future ESOOs and potentially outside of the ESOO cycle if we have some good analysis to share earlier than that. So I'm just going to touch on a few key elements there. The first one is the planning criterion. So our reliability standard or planning criterion in the WEM has two limbs, and we need to set the reserve capacity target to meet both. So effectively the higher of these sets the target. Ever since the WEM has been up and running, we've had limb A setting it, and that hasn't changed through this reliability assessment. But what has changed since last year is that the WEM rules have been amended to tighten limb B of our reliability criteria, or planning criterion, which is has increased the limit on expected unserved energy from 0.002% to 2.002%, so a significant tightening. That followed a change the previous year to limb A, where historically the reserve capacity target, so if you like the peak demand plus reserves plus regulation, needed to cover the biggest single kind of generator contingency on the system. What we were finding is that that was not an adequate reflection of the risks that we were seeing on the power system during transition. And we've had, for example, several periods now over the last 2 years with well over a gigawatt of generation on unplanned outage, coinciding with times of relatively high demand. And so factoring in those risks, there was a rule change made prior to the last ESOO, which saw us significantly increase that reserve capacity, that margin, reserve margin, which is the red chunk you can see on the chart on the right there. And then this year, as I say, the unserved energy limb was tightened as well. That has brought the capacity target under both of those much closer together. But what we do see is that limb A is still the slightly higher one and is setting the requirement over the outlook period at this stage. So while limb A is setting the requirement, limb B analysis is really interesting. So the next slide we have, I guess, just touches on some elements of that. One of the particular things about the expected unserved energy assessment or the limb B assessment is we assume at this point that there is no congestion in the grid, and we factor that in other parts of the assessment. So it's not missing, but it's deliberate through this particular assessment that it's not included. What we see, and you can see from the charts on the bottom left there, is that certainly during these first few years of the outlook period, the purple line, which is the unserved energy modelled assessment, sits well below the limit, which is that 0.002. And then as we get beyond sort of 28, 29 onwards, which is when most of the coal-fired power stations will have retired, that is when we see that limb, I guess, being breached. That is, we can model that there will be more than 0.002 unserved energy. However, that doesn't factor in new generation or new capacity investments that might come in over that period. So that, if you like, takes that teal line from our earlier supply demand assessment. And as that shows a need for investment, so does this equally show a need for investment over that period. What the assessment for this LIM does is really looks at, well, we do quite a detailed modelling exercise, as you'd expect, a wide range of different outage combinations, sort of randomly selected 100 odd outage combinations coupled with 12 weather reference years. And we model every kind of combination and permutation in that period. And what we work out is what, will we satisfy that 0.0002 on average? And on average, as I can say, over the next few years, we expect to. However, what that doesn't do is say that we will never have unserved energy, and that's because we could still have what you might call low probability, high impact events. And that's what the bubble chart on the right there is indicating. So even in those early years of the assessment, there are those unusual combinations and permutations of weather and outages and demand where there may be insufficient supply to meet demand. Now, they're obviously considered lower probability, but just, I think, worth noting that that is the nature of this assessment. The next one I really just wanted to touch on is some of the assumptions we've made around transmission augmentation. So these assessments assume no limits on the network. However, we do otherwise take into account the capability of the network to deliver the energy. And one of the new things that we've done in this ESOO for the first time, and we'll continue to build on, is have a look at whether there are any regional reliability impacts just because of the location of generation and transmission and load. Importantly, all the way through our assessment, we have factored in 2 key network augmentations and some smaller ones, but these are the main ones to call out, which is that the East Regional Energy Project is expected to be completed by 25-26 and the Clean Energy Link North by 27-28 in stages. And they're both really important. The East Regional Energy Project for, I guess, reducing the risk of unserved energy in the Eastern Goldfields region, and the North line to unlock additional transfer capacity there, really mostly to enable new generation up in that part of the grid. So really just identifying there that they're the underlying assumptions that we've built in here, which are quite important. The next slide just has a brief, I guess, summary of some of the analysis we've done around storage. So from this ESOO onwards, one of the many things that the ESOO does is it identifies the duration required for energy storage in our reserve capacity mechanism. Now for 26-27, that has been hardwired as 4 hours, so there won't be any change for projects coming online for 26-27. But what we now do is forecast for future years whether that number is going to change. This is the first year we've run the analysis, and we discovered actually that the nature of the analysis as specified in the rules was leading to an excessive duration requirement, one which didn't look credible. So Energy Policy WA is already consulting, I think, on some amendments to the rules for future years. So what we're really, we don't kind of have a new duration requirement for a future year yet. At this stage, we're not seeing that extend considerably from 4 hours. So just to kind of reassure people looking at projects in the next couple of years, that we're not seeing that increase significantly. However, we do anticipate over time that we will see that stretch out a little bit, maybe to 5 or 6 hours. So we think directionally that's where it's heading, but it's not happening kind of imminently, and we'll provide some future updates on that. And I think finally, while the ESOO is really all about maximum demand and consumption, we do use this as an opportunity to see where our minimum demand levels on the grid are going. So we've indicated distributed PV is growing at a faster rate than we previously forecast. And I think in last year's ESOO, we thought we might be hitting, I guess, the tipping point or the minimum point at which demand was going to go by about the end of this decade before it crept up. Again, over time. However, with the stronger than previously anticipated growth in DPV, we're now seeing minimum demand continue to decline for longer. And if it wasn't managed, potentially take the grid to a below 0 megawatts over the outlook period. Now, of course, we're never going to run the grid with negative energy on it. And we do have really strong investment in battery storage, large-scale battery storage at the moment, and the forecasts for considerable investment in smaller scale storage that I shared earlier. And really what we're trying to do here is just highlight how important that storage is going to be to shift that, the solar PV, store it in the batteries and then make it available for dispatch. at times of day when demand is higher, and that will be really essential to us keeping a stable system through these minimum demand periods. Now, we had anticipated some challenges in managing minimum demand, and we have already procured 446 megawatts of minimum demand service for 24-25 to 26-27, so for 2 years, really to enable us to, or to enable some, those facilities to be providing a service where they are deliberately soaking up that solar in the middle of the day, and therefore making it available when the system needs it more. So that's really just one to watch, and really highlights the key role that batteries are going to play, not just in meeting peak demand, but actually in helping us minimise the risk of minimum demand on the system as well. And finally, the last slide, I think, just summarises some of the key changes that we've seen, and which I've pretty well summed up there. So we have seen an adjustment to that second limit of the planning criterion. We have introduced a regional capacity shortfall assessment, and we have now looked at we're starting to look at the duration requirements for electric storage resources, ESR, and increasingly the capacity needed by specific capability classes as they've been redefined to in the WEM rules. As it says, these changes don't have any immediate implications for the 26-27 outlook. However, we anticipate as our modelling matures and as the rules, I guess, adjust in some cases, that these will start to indicate more specific needs in the future, and we'll keep you up to date on those as we can. And I think I might stop talking there. Thank you for bearing with me. I can see we've got a few questions in the chat, but I'm going to let Toby facilitate some Q&A, and thankfully I'm supported by Toby and the team as a bit of the brains trust who worked on the ESOO, so I'll flick the hard ones to them. Thanks, Toby.
Thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciated. Yeah, we've got a few questions in the chat. I might start to run through those in order, but feel free to put your hand up if you've got any questions you'd like to ask verbally. The first question we've got here is from Wayne Trumbull, and the question is relating to whether the reserve capacity expected improvement, so that the picture that we're seeing improving from the last WEM ESOO, has been largely a result of the rates paid by MO for NCAS projects. Do you want to take that one, Kate, or do you want me to?
I can take that one. So the main contributor to the improvement has been the additional capacity procured through those non-co-optimised essential system service projects. So yes is the short answer. The focus on rates is potentially a little misleading. So probably a couple of things. On average, what we've been signing up through those NCAS procurement processes has actually not been terribly different to where the reserve capacity price is now going. So while we are paying a premium and every project is a little bit different, they are competitive tender processes, and actually while we can't publish kind of some of the specific details of those contracts, actually on average the premium is not as great as you might assume that it is. I think what's beneficial about the NCAS process is that it gives us a little bit more flexibility, which we've needed during this phase of the transition, quite frankly, as we've kind of come out of COVID. We've seen decarb commitments start to take shape, and we've had to respond really quickly to that to maintain a supply-demand balance. And that's what we've used the NCAS projects for, or processes for. We do hope we're not running NCAS processes for reliability going forward, because of course in parallel to us using those, there's been changes to the way that we set the reserve capacity target in the ESOO, which I've shared with you. So that's now signalling through this mechanism the need for additional capacity going forward. So those market signals are now in place, and things like the reserve capacity price have adjusted in recent years as well. So hopefully that the signals through our normal market mechanism, the RCM, will actually be the more dominant, I guess, signal now for investment going forward. We don't plan to run any more NCASs for reliability.
Thank you, Kate. There's a question here from Ganesh. Is there any plans to review the ESS charge as $1 per megawatt hour that ends up being passed through to market customers? This has been quite volatile in the recent months.
Ooh.
It's a tricky one because it falls outside somewhat of the scope of the WEM ESOO. I think I would probably refer you to some of our RIF working group sessions. So that's the real-time market insights forum, where this topic has been discussed at length. And it's also worth acknowledging that Energy Policy WA are currently or just kicking off a review of the ESS frameworks, and they're given their new markets that we've only had circa 9 months of operation of, looking at how those are playing out and whether they're aligning with the original policy intent. And I'll paste a link to that review in the chat. The next one here is from Brad Smart, and this relates to the minimum demand forecast and the impact of storage. And the question is, does this mean that storage will become a must-run overnight to ensure that it's available to soak up the next day during low load seasons? That's a good question, Brad. So the data that we presented in the earlier slide was really an economic simulation of likely storage outcomes, to look at the expected behaviour given the prevailing market conditions that we were forecasting, and that was showing that the minimum demand minimums were sufficient incentive to be in a state that batteries were seeking to charge during the day. So effectively, as you say, discharging over the morning peak, so that one could charge for that negatively priced energy during the day, and then be available for the evening peak. But it's certainly, given the quantum of storage coming to the system and the criticality of that charging behaviour, that we get more visibility and clearer insights as to the behaviour of batteries going forward. The next question we've got here is from Rhiannon. Are you able to advise on the expected implementation and starting times for the flexible capacity from the RCM rules?
Do you want me to have a go at that, Toby? The short answer is we are anticipating having the flexible capacity product implemented in time for next year's capacity cycle. So for the 2025 cycle, which will procure capacity for 27, 28 onwards. And actually, while I've got that, one thing I didn't mention on the way through is actually some of those changes which are going to help incentivise capacity in the long run. I've mentioned that the RCM has been adjusting. We do, of course, have the new flexible capacity product, which will be coming online. And of course, the Commonwealth Government's Capacity Investment Scheme, which is running its first tender for the Swiss, starting very shortly, actually, which will be a storage tender initially, but we anticipate future tenders in that space as well. So there's a few different mechanisms which hopefully will support investors over this period.
Thank you, Kate. The next one I've got here is from Wayne again. And what is the expected cost recovery in each of the next 3 years for NCAS? I don't know if you want to take that one, Kate. I would say that there has been acknowledgement that the amount of information that is published associated with NCAS procurements is perhaps deficient, and the ability for participants to gain that full visibility is somewhat lacking. And the MISC 3 amendments that were published a couple of weeks ago for consultation by Energy Policy WA do include some uplift to AEMO's obligation for publication of information. So I'd recommend you have a look at those rules to make sure that's capturing all the information that you think should be required to be published.
And thanks, Wayne, for the question. And Toby might be a little bit more of an expert on some of the terms and conditions of the NCAS arrangements than I am. But in essence, for the reliability service peak demand, it is a payment that is very much akin to a reserve capacity payment and will be allocated to customers in a similar way over the duration of those contract terms. What is offset from the payments that we provide are payments through the reserve capacity mechanism. So if you are awarded an NCAS contract, you are required to participate in the next available capacity cycle, and we don't pay twice. So those payments get netted off. Have I missed anything, Toby?
No, I probably didn't cover off the intent to look at the cost recovery methodology for NCAS procurement, particularly for peak demand service, to look at a more appropriate sort of cause of pays framework to leverage the individual reserve capacity requirement IRCR recovery for those peak demand NCAS costs. The next question I have here, I think, is from Amra, which follows on from Brad's question around storage charging behaviour. And given the issues that have been created by distributed PV, is there going to be a policy level approach to distributed storage to ensure control of those systems can be commandeered? I wouldn't necessarily use that phraseology by AEMO to service anticipated system needs separately from any distribution system operator arrangements. I feel like that's a good question for Brad.
It does. We won't put you on the spot, Brad, but I'll share a couple of thoughts on that, which is that absolutely looking at how distributed energy resources can contribute to the system is front and centre. It's a priority of AEMOs as well as others in the sector. We completed Project Symphony just recently, and you can find the final reports now on ARENA's website. That has absolutely demonstrated the technical capability of DER to provide a number of services to the network and to the market. And we've started seeing some early stage of aggregated DER participation through things like our NCAS and supplementary reserve capacity mechanisms. So we are absolutely taking steps in that direction. And the DER roadmap, and I think there's an update due to that shortly as well, will really outline what that next stage of work looks like.
Thank you, Kate. There's a follow-on question here from Oscar. On the back of Rhiannon's question, is there an expected date when the draft flexible capacity accreditation criteria will be published?
I think we will have to take that one on notice, Oscar. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Oscar. We will follow up with you. And then we've got a question for Rhiannon, just noting that the cost recovery for the minimum demand service that we've procured through NCAS may need further consideration, as it doesn't seem to align with cause of pays, given those costs will be distributed to loads at the time we're requiring more load. I think, Rhiannon, that was raised at the TDOG running through the MISC 3 amendments last week. And yeah, I'm sure that will be explored further through that forum. I don't think I've got any additional questions in the chat. I don't see any hands up, but if anyone is keen to ask a question verbally, feel free to come off mute and ask a question. Otherwise, I might keep watching the chat expectantly. No further questions? Oh.
While you're doing that, I might just remind everyone, and I think most of you have already done this, but today is the deadline for certified reserve capacity applications to be in, please. So if you haven't dotted every I and crossed every T and hit OK, please do that as quickly as possible today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. We have got a couple more comments. Aidan has just noted that the next update of the DER roadmap is due to be released in the next month or so. And consistent with the previous approach, the initial focus will always be to ensure that customer behaviours are incentivised rather than required. Thank you for that, Aidan. And thanks there from Rhiannon. Thanks, Rhiannon. So with that, I think we may close the session. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Kate, for the presentation. And we look forward to any questions that you may wish to submit via email. I'll find the, oh yeah, it was already up on the screen. Any additional feedback would certainly welcome to the Future System Design email address on the screen there. Thanks all for your participation. Have a great day.
Thank you, Toby. Thanks all.